It's hissing like crazy.
Oh,
Thank you.
so final testimony before lunch is we're going to talk about our next fee report, and we are going to hear from Secretary Moore to take us through just like a very high level view of the work that they did in collaboration with the Joint Fiscal Office. And I'm grateful for, I know it's a big ask, so I'm grateful that you were able to fulfill it. Your floor is yours.
Sorry, I was trying to get my computer checked in beforehand. Saoirse. Saoirse and I used to be on our school board together.
Oh.
Back in the day.
Wait a minute, like Saoirse leaves this room?
She does.
Before she came into this room.
Actually. So I sent a slide deck around this morning with just a fairly high level overview that hopefully will be helpful in giving context. There's a few things I would love for you to take away from the presentation. One is that the Agency of Natural Resources has a lot of fees. And this is a complex landscape, but let me jump into the Teams or the Zoom meeting so I can share my screen with all of you. And while it's letting me in, I'm joined by Maggie Gendron, who's the Deputy Secretary of the agency. I suspect to most of you, she's probably a familiar face, but glad to have her here with me today. You're not? If I
We
hit.
are grateful for these small technology moments. Our own thoughts. Or at least I'm grateful for them.
Yeah, it just asked me if I would like to join a meeting. Oh, are you letting me in?
Oh, there we are.
All right.
Oh my God. It's really small. This is the other.
No,
Anyone else looking at the spreadsheet?
I have it open.
I'm really good at Teams. Zoom.
We hear that rumor. Someone who works in both fairly regularly. Zoom is the superior
Yeah.
option.
All right.
Be it all possible to get the spreadsheet in Excel form?
No, I posted the report and it's not really readable. I go to her slideshow and then if you want the full report, I can copy for you.
Yeah, we can get the full report as an Excel document. Maggie, would you be willing to ask Kim to send that?
Thank you.
All right.
I think if I do this. All right. Perfect. So I thought I'd start just by offering a little bit of context around ANR's current year budget, in part because our budget has grown dramatically during my tenure as secretary, and in particular, sort of over the last 3 or 4 years here. So our current year budget's just over $230 million. That was an increase of nearly $40 million above the year before. This is largely being driven, as you might expect, by ARPA and bipartisan infrastructure law, or Inflation Investment and Jobs Act, however you want to refer to it, in the current budget year. We have 650 roughly full-time year-round employees, about 10% of which are limited service positions that were added to the agency as a result of all of these federal funds to help us support their administration. We also add 400 seasonal workers each summer, the vast majority of whom staff our state parks, but then we also have seasonal staff that are supporting field work in fish and wildlife and environmental conservation. $230 million looks like a big number, but about 3/4 of that ends up being passed through to municipalities or partner organizations or let out through contracts. And about 80% of the agency's overall budget is comprised of special funds, which I know is of particular interest to this committee, and federal funds. And we first utilize all of that projected special fund and federal fund revenue before moving on to general funds. Just in way of a little preview, and I don't think I'm giving anything away, our 25 budget's going to be $292 million roughly, so a $62 million increase even over the current year. And that means we're up about $100 million over the last 2 fiscal years. And it is almost exclusively increased federal funds, ARPA, bipartisan infrastructure law, and going into 25, the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think it's also important to look at how this money looks across the agency. As you can see, better than a third of our overall budget is federal funds. We get about $36 million a year worth of general funds. And then of interest, I think, to the conversation today are the areas of this little chart that I've circled in red, which is really where our fee revenue ends up. So the DEC special funds is our includes things like the Solid Waste Management Assistance Fund is probably the biggest component of that. The permit fund is where the revenues generated by permits issued for things like stormwater and wastewater and drinking water end up. Parks fund is where the gross receipts from the state park system are deposited, along with the ski lease revenue that we collect for ski areas that are operating a part of their businesses on lands of the state. And then Fish and Wildlife Funds is where license revenue from the Fish and Wildlife Department is deposited. It's important to recognize that even though I said a third, in reality, we're more like a quarter now, but things are sort of being skewed by all of that federal funding. Is fees and income into our special funds. It really does vary significantly across divisions and programs. I picked these 2 divisions in DEC because they probably present some of the starkest contrast. On the left-hand side of the screen is our air quality division, who about half of their budget is generated through permit fund revenue. And then in the other end of the spectrum is our water investment division that manages our state revolving funds and is responsible for most of the loans we are making for wastewater and drinking water system improvements to municipalities. And you can see that they, on average, collect less than $100,000 worth of revenue a year, although their division budget is approaching $10 million.
Secretary Moore, thank you. Can you just maybe fill in the blanks on what the other special funds are?
Sure. In the case of the Water Investment Division, that's largely the state revolving fund. We are able to take is the word I want to use, but it's the only one coming to mind, take an administrative fee off of each one of the loans we issue out of those programs that helps cover the cost of those staff. And most of that special fund revenue in that case is how we're using the state revolving fund dollars to both make loans and cover our administrative costs. Our fees also take a lot of different forms. There are fees assessed when permits are applied for, and they sometimes are actually 2 parts where we charge a separate fee for our administrative review as opposed to our technical review. Many of our permits have an ongoing annual or renewal cycle, sometimes up to once every 5 years where a fee is assessed. And if applicants are looking to make a significant change to their permit, there's often a fee associated with that amendment. In addition, as I was describing in our other departments, we issue licenses, leases, special use permits, and some of our fees take the form of surcharges. So this is everything from entry fees at state parks to fees associated with facilities we own, or we have some leases associated with cell towers that sit atop some of our state forests to improve communication. So
Like ski mountains.
Correct, or ski mountains. Yep. And so just to sort of put some numbers to it,
Before you, where do buildbacks fit into this scheme for you?
we have fairly modest billback provisions. They largely will, well, we can sort of jump to this one. They largely sit in the A&R Secretary's office and are related to the review of Act 250 and Section 248 projects. We also, the other place where we have significant billback authority that we utilize is in the review of hydroelectric generation facilities. And we have contract agreements, actually. I don't know that they would probably fit under special fund revenue. But they're letter contract agreements where the owners and operators of hydroelectric facilities are agreeing to compensate the agency for our engagement in their federal regulatory processes. So within the Secretary's office, we have 8 different fees, but they're almost exclusively related to the agency's engagement in the review of Act 250 and Section 248 projects. FPR has just over 20 different fees. Most of them are related to park prices. But as I indicated, there are licenses and special use permits for folks looking to undertake different activities on state lands, as well as our ski leases. Fish and Wildlife, as we start to get into the more complicated components of the agency's fee structure, has over 100 different fees. Most of them are hunting and fishing licenses. I think similar to park prices, that it's important to keep in mind when it comes to hunting and fishing licenses, this isn't a captive audience. People have to get a stormwater permit. You don't have to get a fishing license. And so there's more price sensitivity we found historically around hunting and fishing licenses and park prices than some of the other fees ANR assesses. We also run conservation camps and then have a whole bevy of collections permits for folks that are looking to collect different plants and animals, mostly for research purposes. And then finally, DEC, which has nearly 300 different fees around a variety of different activities, air emissions and waste generation, drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater, both the treatment, design of new systems, construction of new systems, and then ongoing treatment. We have a regulatory program around dams and dam safety, as well as resource-based permits looking to protect rivers, wetlands, and shorelands specifically. And so I know one of the questions that had been asked for in the fee report was when the last time each one of these different fees had been changed. This is a fairly high-level summary. When you get the spreadsheet, you can dig in, but I think this paints a fairly accurate picture. So starting again with the Secretary's office, our ability to assess fees related to our engagement in Act 250 and Section 248 was established in 2015 and was subsequently adjusted in 2017 following a restructuring of the PUC net metering rule. Park prices were overhauled in August of last year based on recommendations from a benchmarking study that we partnered with the Department of Financial Regulation on that specifically found we were woefully undercharging out-of-state guests, particularly when compared to what Vermonters were being charged to visit state parks in other New England states. And that overhaul of the park price structure, we believe will generate about $1 million worth of additional revenue a year. This is the first full year where we will see that effect.
And those you have jurisdiction to change on your own legislative.
Correct. It's a rule. All of the, why we call them prices, and maybe that's too cute by a half, but because they are established through rule. As opposed to by statute. Fish and Wildlife, we had come to the General Assembly in 2020 and sought and received some changes for lifetime license prices. This has been a giant money loser for the agency in that we offer lifetime licenses to newborns effectively for a very modest price. And then they never have to purchase a hunting and fishing license again. So those price adjustments were approved back in 2020, but most of the other licenses within Fish and Wildlife were last adjusted in 2015 and 2016.
And my understanding is that those, like of all of the sort of fees going around, I think of those as one of the more elastic fees that you have in that changes in prices might really affect behavior.
Correct. We are very concerned about that. And there are larger national trends to which Vermont is not immune that have seen the number of people hunting in particular in Vermont has sort of steadily declined. And we are very reluctant to do anything that would accelerate that. On the fishing side of the house, we have, I think what I've heard the team in Fish and Wildlife refer to is a lot of churn, that there are 800,000 or so people that have purchased a fishing license in the last 3 to 5 years. About half of those purchased them in any given year. And so they've put a lot of effort into trying to get people to renew their fishing licenses more annually.
Get us in the weeds, but I mean, it's really helpful to hear what you're saying about sort of trends and content, like, it's all really helpful information. Do you all have that kind of data or trend analysis? That, I mean, so, I'm looking at the report and it looks like, it's more a sort of spot in time and, kind of understanding the broader context for some of the fees that you're talking about is really helpful.
We absolutely do. I mean, we do our own data and tracking, particularly in Fish and Wildlife, and we should separate that from DEC fees in particular, because we rely on license revenue to access federal funds under the Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson Acts. And so having a projection about what we can expect to take in license revenue is really important.
And understanding how it's changed over time.
Yeah,
So
yeah, we had,
all of that would be.
Maggie and I can follow up. I'm not sure how much of it is done formally, like in a way that would make sense to share with other people. Well, or it may be in spreadsheets that are perfectly useful for our purposes, but may not make any sense to people not in the Fish and Wildlife business office. So let us see what we have and can follow up.
When we get to the full report, there is sort of a column and analysis of other states. That's like deep in the weeds of the report.
Yeah, which is harder on the DEC side of things. And just finishing up this slide, most of the DEC permit fees were last adjusted in 2016. That said, there have been several new fees added as clean water programs have come online. Many of those clean water programs were established by Act 64 of 2015, but we had a period of up to 5 years to sort of bring them to fruition. And that includes the 3-acre stormwater requirements as well as the municipal roads general permit. And then, as you may recall, several years ago, the General Assembly passed a rule dropping the threshold for when a stormwater permit is required from 1 acre to a ½ acre of impervious surface. And so that is a new fee going into our permit fund as well. And just I think from my vantage, the key takeaway I hope you'll have is that there isn't really an approach to adjusting A&R fees that's going to be both simple and equitable, that this is a real complex stew we have here with some that are elastic, some that are inelastic, some that go to individuals, some that go to corporations, and it's a complex set of fees.
That is the crux of our problem, which is that like we really don't want to take a blunt instrument to something that is nuanced, and it's very hard to do without very active collaboration because of that. And so maybe as we go forward, you could take sort of a harm reduction view of the whole thing. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. Representative Brennan, did I see your hand?
No,
Okay.
that's
Okay.
communicating.
Okay. Great. Sorry.
About this.
Okay.
It's all right. It's under control.
Yeah, I realize
Yeah,
that
already.
drinking water and the clean water are matching funds to federal, so you draw down, but that I think comes from the capital bill.
It does.
Do you have any other matching situations that you need to meet?
Fish and Wildlife is the other significant match. So we use license revenue to match federal dollars that are available for wildlife conservation as well as fisheries.
And is there enough in there to draw down as much as you can from the federal?
Generally, yes. I think there was a bump on the Pittman-Robertson side of the house. So perhaps backing up, Pittman-Robertson revenues at the federal level are generated by an excise tax on the sale of outdoor gear and equipment that includes bullets and guns. And there was a significant uptick in the sale, unfortunately, of guns and bullets during the Trump administration, which resulted in a significant uptick in the revenue available or the resources available to the agency in that account. We have several years to pull those dollars down. and have worked with partners to ensure we're able to take full advantage of that bump in funds. For example, I think the National Trips the Wild Turkey Foundation or the Grouse Association has provided us with a contribution to match some of those federal funds so that we're able to take full advantage of what is sitting in that account and sort of set aside for Vermont.
Are there restrictions in what you can use to match?
It has to be non-federal funding.
Just non-federal, but it can come from general fund, it can come from anywhere.
And that's why sometimes we have partner organizations that step forward and say, well, if you're willing to do this sort of work, we would be willing to provide those match dollars.
Okay.
Is that a Grouse Foundation, like the bird? Okay. Representative.
Is there a drawdown arrangement that touches forest parks and recreation, or is it just fish and wildlife?
To the best of my knowledge, and I can go back and confirm, there isn't one in Forest Parks and Recreation. For FPR, the primary fees that are assessed are park gate fees and then our ski leases. The licenses and rentals are a much smaller piece. Almost all of that obviously sits in the Parks Fund. Nothing comes immediately to mind around our forestry division. That is all.
Managing state forests, there's no
Well, it's a lot, and private forests.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's no fees associated with that work.
Will there be an increased demand, I guess, for expertise as the state moves forward with the conservation land expansion or percentage of conserved land?
I think there's a bit of to be determined
Okay.
there, and that maybe ask again next year.
Okay.
If we keep it
Because
that way.
yeah.
Yeah, no, good
Thanks.
question.
Thank you.
Representative.
Thanks, Carlos. Is there anywhere in the report that maybe I'm missing that sort of matches total revenue and the expense for, each use?
That is virtually impossible for us to do, because back to, maybe that's not the right one.
I mean, like, take parks, for example, right? I go to the park, I pay an entry fee. I
Correct.
assume that fee is going towards the management of the parks. And is there an opportunity to sort of connect all of the revenue sources and the expenses that they go towards to see how in balance they are or aren't?
So in state parks, yes. And in Fish and Wildlife, mostly. And in DEC? I don't think so, because all of the DEC fees from stormwater and wastewater and wetlands are deposited into our environmental permit fund. And so, and then staff charges are drawn out, and I think looking at this may be important too, which is each program has a different sources of revenue that are available to it. And so their pulls on the permit fund vary according to that.
Yeah, so I can understand we may not be able to get that for everyone, but in the places where it is easier to sort of match the fees with the expenses that they are supposed to support, I think it would be helpful, especially to kind of understand those trends over time. And I guess I'm curious whether you could speak at a kind of high level about how our high inflationary period and the not adjusting fees for the last 7 years impacts your budget and ability to do our work.
I mean, I think, so at the same time that there are absolutely inflationary pressures, I would say our budget remains whole, that we don't have vacant positions, we haven't riffed people, and so we have been able to make it work while meeting our obligations under the collective bargaining agreement and all of those other pieces. And so I'm not sure what the other measures or metrics would be of.
I mean, I guess one of them might be backlogs and wait times for, so it sounds like we're able to be whole with what we have, but I guess I wonder how, I mean, to me, it seems like in a high inflationary period, not adjusting fees for even inflation ends up being a budget cut, and it sounds like it doesn't have to come out of staff positions, but imagine something that has impact maybe on the customer experience side.
Yeah, I mean, I can look into that. That's also a dynamic space. We had a heavy commitment to lean process improvement. And then specifically sort of post-COVID had ad hoc taken almost all of our permitting programs and moved them into our ANR online system, which has some real administrative time savings benefits, and have been working sort of as we've moved through the crisis of COVID and into a new normal to solidify the changes we made kind of ad hoc, and are continuing to see the benefits of that. One of the pieces that we've talked about and I think haven't fully resolved for ourselves are some of the electronic fees associated with electronic filings that may be the most significant sort of impact on our budget as we've taken more online permits.
I mean, great to hear about all those process improvements. I mean, I know that probably over the last 7 years, we haven't asked you to do less. It seems like we are asking you to do more and more, 30 by 30 being sort of one of the big things on your plate. We've also had unexpected things like the flood. And, I know at least just anecdotally in my conversations with, some staff who were working on cleaning up tire dumps, it's like, I had to pause that because we all had to pivot to work on the flood, and we're going to have to put that effort to, address needs in your communities on pause until we can get back, this other thing. So I guess, I in particular be curious about some of the, wait times and permanent kind of customer service experience side, and how that relates to our ability to raise revenue to do our work.
Sure. We track PEP standards and can provide that information, particularly on the DEC side of the house in terms of what our average permit cycle time is.
Representative Bodie.
I have heard anecdotally that a concern that we may not be able to get all the ARPA money for clean water because we aren't process permits so that and things with engineering so that the projects can get going. I wonder if you could respond to that.
Sure. I actually think we are in pretty good shape when it comes to ARPA and have our ability to have those dollars fully deployed by the end of the calendar year when sort of the ARPA clock will run out. I know that there was some information shared by Doug Farnham recently that raised a lot of concerns for folks. And part of it is many of our projects involve complex funding stacks where we're making commitments, in particular to municipalities, but also to some other entities. And they are still building the rest of the funding stack, pulling in resources for example, from USDA Rural Development. We feel like we have milestones and benchmarks we're going to hold those projects to, where if they can't complete their funding stack, we're going to have to move to Plan B, but do feel like we are in a position to fully utilize those dollars. And Maggie recently updated a set of fact sheets around where each of the programs stand that provide some of that nuance, and happy to share those with you if they'd be helpful.
I just don't want to get to a point and hear of what we couldn't pull down in $10 of the ARPA money.
No, I share your same concern and assure you we are doing everything in our power to get those dollars on the ground. You would. I mean, honestly, the response from the governor's team and the General Assembly to our unprecedented request for 50 limited service positions out of the gate to support this work has been critical in our ability to get these dollars on the ground. We couldn't have done it without that additional capacity. You're welcome.
Thanks. Given the amount of time that the legislature and the administration spend thinking about housing and trying to find ways to build more housing in the state, is the current fee structure within A&R, is it robust enough to support timely responses to issuances and permits and that type of situation that could move things, perhaps move things faster than what we're seeing right now?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a balance to be struck there and probably a range of opinions in terms of what people can afford and how fast we can move. It's an optimization problem. And I think we're in a pretty good spot, but others may disagree. One of the points I did share with Representative Kornheiser that's been brought to us about some of our permit fees, it was specific to things like wetlands where there's a significant upfront cost in applying for the permit. And often these housing projects are sort of months, if not a couple of years before they start to cash flow and generate revenue through unit sales. One of the questions that's been asked of us is if there's an opportunity to charge a percentage of the wetlands permit fee upfront and then collect the balance at some point in the future. We're looking at what that would mean for us in terms of cash flow and our permit fund. But I think those sorts of ideas are the places where we may have the most impact on the housing conversation and not serving as an unintentional barrier to projects just getting out of the gate.
Representative.
I wanted to ask about stormwater fees, particularly the impermeable surface assessments around the state.
Yes.
Are all those funds committed to particular projects forever and ever? I don't say ever, but for the immediate future.
So if you're talking the 3-acre permit program,
Yeah.
so the fees associated with that program go into our permit fund and are used to fund staff in the watershed management division broadly in reviewing permits and providing compliance assistance.
Not any of it go towards making good on our promise to the EPA to protect Lake Champlain?
Well, the work that's accomplished as a result of the permits absolutely is essential to it. And there is some opportunity if a landowner does not have space on their property to install stormwater management, they'll pay an offset or mitigation fee, and those fees would be used for other projects. But generally, the sort of standard permit issuance fees are being used to cover our staff costs.
I say that to follow Representative Sims' interest in the connection between the source of the funds and the purpose to which they're put. And I just share a complaint, folks who are paying for the privilege of owning impermeable surfaces saying, but I don't contribute to the pollution in Lake Champlain. Why are you dinging me? As opposed to protecting the city of Barrie from the runoff and wherever. And I don't have an answer because I didn't know the mechanism and where the funds went.
Sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just while we're on clean water and such, the sunset on the clean water money is sort of coming up, not immediately, fortunately, but soon-ish. So let's think about starting a conversation.
Yeah, no, that is something we support, extending that sunset. It was never quite clear why it was extended, but not all the way to the end of our obligations with EPA, and the governor's commitment remains to funding that work through to completion, which is scheduled for either 2036 or 2037.
Yeah, and I think this is it's an opportunity for us to check in about it. Sometimes we've been at sunsets just so we remember things.
Is there like a special fund balance list if one wanted to know?
I do believe JFO could deliver that to us.
Terrific. And maybe this is more of a BA question, but like while you're here in the chair, can you talk a little bit about the BA request to move from the solid waste management fund, the 3.5 million for PCB testing?
Sure.
And how that impacts or doesn't the bottom line of that fund and the other uses of that fund?
Yes. So both the proposal for folks who may not be familiar is to transfer $3.5 million from the Solid Waste Management Assistance Fund into the Environmental Contingency Fund. And the Environmental Contingency Fund is what we've been relying on to support testing for PCBs and indoor airs in Vermont schools. Both of those programs sit within our waste management division, and in talking with the director of the waste management division, his clear priority is continuing the testing around PCBs and preventing exposures to this known human carcinogen. Generally, the solid waste management fund is tipping fees are deposited in it each year. It is a robust fund, and it is one that we use to offer competitive grants. In the past, we have supported household hazardous waste collection, the construction of composting facilities at solid waste management collection sites, among other things out of that fund. There's nothing that we've committed to that we're pulling back on by proposing that transfer. Rather, it reflects a prioritization of our work.
And the need for the shift to the contingency fund is that the costs of continuing to test for PCBs in schools is beyond what we have already set aside for it.
Correct. We gave our best estimate, in 2022. In particular, the costs of both materials sampling have been far higher than what we anticipated. It's just truth in advertising. This will get us through half of the schools. It's enough funding sort of to carry us at the pace we feel is most appropriate through the end of fiscal year 25, but there will still be half of the 324 schools that should be tested to be tested.
And did allocating a significant amount of funds to remediate one particular school impact the shortfall in that fund?
Not on the testing side. So we actually have two different funds we're accessing to do this work. DEC, through the Environmental Contingency Fund, is paying for the indoor air testing, the materials testing, and sort of the evaluation of alternatives on how to best mitigate or remediate. The actual mitigation and remediation is being paid for out of that reserve that was created in the Ed Fund. The reserve was about, I think, $29.5 million. As you're alluding to, 16 of that was earmarked for Burlington. Of that other 13.5, we have currently spent just about $4.5 million. So have about a $9 million balance. And our best projections is that's about what we'll need also to carry us through 2025 based on current experience in terms of the number of schools that require kind of construction mitigation or remediation as opposed to air filter units. We are anticipating 7 to 10 additional schools will need, in particular, most of it's been window replacements with some really horrifying levels of PCBs contained in window caulk.
We are past, we will definitely have more conversations about PCBs in the context of the education fund and other things like that. And I'm wondering if there's anything else you want to share with us before we wrap up. Want to sort of invite you to be thinking about places where you'd be interested in reducing fees in the context of this before we sort of see each other again.
Sure. Yeah, and I think to the extent you want to dig into DEC, we can bring some experts in that space, Fish and Wildlife, that space, FPR. My hope was just to kind of stage set on behalf of all of the agency, but each of them is a pretty different animal.
This was really helpful. Thank you. Our next step is to talk to JFO about sort of the analysis they've done. And then we'll dig into individual sections as we go forward.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.